Forward Operating Base Scorpion, deep in the Sahara Desert. Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb stood watch on the perimeter when he heard something that made his blood freeze. A voice coming from the sandstorm, calling his full name, Marcus Anthony Webb, the name only his mother had used. But the voice didn't stop there. It told him about the day his childhood dog died, about how 7-year-old Marcus had buried the animal behind the shed, about the secret he'd carried for 22 years, that he'd been the one who left the gate open. Webb's hands shook as he keyed his radio. 13 other rangers were inside that outpost, sheltering from what was supposed to be a routine sandstorm. A standard 3-day rotation, a simple defensive position until extraction, but nothing about the next 72 hours would be routine. In 3 days, only one of them would make it out. He'd be found wandering 3 miles from base, covered in sand from head to toe, repeating the same sentence over and over. The desert knows. The desert remembers. The desert is listening. This is the story of what happened to Ranger Team Scorpion, of how 14 elite soldiers faced something that knew their deepest secrets, their darkest memories, their greatest fears. Something that lived in the sand, something that was hungry, something that wanted to add them to itself. And this is the story of how the last transmission from Forward Operating Base Scorpion, buried in classified files for 16 years, ended with 5 words that no one can explain. We are grains now. Billions. Welcome to Signal 7, and today we're covering Operation Sand Whisper, a military encounter that was never meant to be disclosed. If these stories interest you, like and subscribe for more. 16 years later, Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb sits in a psychiatric facility outside Fort Bragg, undergoing his 48th mandatory evaluation. His file has grown to over 300 pages, and every single page is stamped with the same red letters. Classified. Psych evil inconclusive. 47 previous interviews, and 47 times he's told the exact same story, word for word, detail for detail, never varying from the narrative he first gave when they pulled him from the desert. The psychiatrists call it fixed false memory, a trauma response, dissociative disorder brought on by extreme stress. They point to the impossible elements of his account, voices that knew secrets they shouldn't, sand that moved with purpose and intent, rangers who vanished and became particles, and a consciousness that somehow lived in the storm itself. But there are things in Webb's medical file that the psychiatrists can't explain away. The sand in his lungs, appearing in his respiratory system no matter how many times they clear it, sand that consistently tests as Sahara composition despite the fact that Marcus Webb has never returned to Mali since his discharge in 2009. And there are other reports, 3 other soldiers from different bases and different units, all stationed in North Africa around the same period, all reporting similar symptoms and similar dreams, all claiming they hear voices in sandstorms, voices that whisper names, voices that know things they shouldn't, voices that call to them from the wind. Webb agreed to tell his story one more time, to have it recorded and documented, not because he expects anyone to believe him. After 16 years, he's long since accepted that nobody will, but because every time a sandstorm rises somewhere in the world, he feels them, his missing rangers, still conscious, still aware, still waiting. Someone needs to know what's out there, in the sand, in the wind, in the spaces between the grains, because the desert remembers everything, and what it remembers, it never lets go. Webb begins his account the way he always does, with the facts, with the details that can be verified, with the before. Ranger Team Scorpion arrived at Forward Operating Base Scorpion on December 14th, 2008. 14 rangers in total, all combat veterans, all experienced in desert operations. The base sat 47 miles from the nearest settlement, a concrete bunker half buried in sand that served as a standard defensive position in the ongoing operations in Mali. Their mission was textbook simple. Hold the outpost for 72 hours, maintain communication with command, and wait for extraction, a standard rotation that every ranger in the unit had done dozens of times before. The team consisted of Webb as ranking sergeant, with Corporal James Victorino serving as their radio operator, Specialist Rachel Okonkwo as their combat medic, and Private First Class Tyler Kessler as the youngest member at 22. The others, Ortega, Chen, Rodriguez, Morgan, and 6 more, were all experienced soldiers who'd trained together, fought together, and trusted each other with their lives. The weather briefing had mentioned a sandstorm, moderate intensity, expected to pass through in 4 to 6 hours. Nothing unusual, nothing they hadn't dealt with before. Everything was routine, everything was standard, everything made perfect sense. Webb remembers the last normal moment, 1600 hours on December 15th, 4 in the afternoon, as the sunset painted the Sahara in shades of orange and red. It was beautiful, the kind of scene you'd photograph if you weren't in a combat zone, the kind of moment that made you forget, just briefly, where you were and what you were doing. That's when someone noticed the horizon, and the sandstorm that appeared wasn't anything like the briefing had described. It wasn't moderate, it was a wall, a solid wall of sand 300 feet high, stretching from one end of the visible horizon to the other and moving toward them at a speed that would later make seasoned meteorologists use the word impossible. The Rangers had 15 minutes to seal the base, reinforcing every door, shuttering every window, covering every ventilation shaft with triple-layered filters, engaging emergency protocols, checking and double-checking the generator, securing all communication equipment, and getting everyone inside. At 18:15 hours, the storm hit forward operating base Scorpion like a physical blow. The sound was deafening, but it wasn't wind, not the whistle and howl they'd heard in previous storms. This was different, deeper. Like the sand itself was speaking in a language just below human hearing, a vibration that you felt in your chest before you heard it with your ears. Visibility dropped to 0 in seconds as the world outside the reinforced windows became nothing but orange-red chaos. Sand so thick it looked solid, dense enough that their searchlights couldn't penetrate more than 3 feet into the maelstrom. Communication with command became difficult, then impossible, static, heavy interference, and then nothing but dead air. The Rangers weren't particularly worried at first, since storm interference was common and command knew exactly where they were. Extraction was still 48 hours away. They had supplies, they had shelter, they had each other. Standard procedure was to wait it out, since sandstorms lasted hours, not days, and by morning the worst would be over. That's what they thought, that's what they believed, but they were wrong. The storm didn't stop. 8 hours passed, then 12, then 16, and still the sand kept coming. The wind never decreased, and that low rumbling vibration that made their teeth ache and their bones feel loose in their skin continued without pause. Webb assigned watch rotations with 2 Rangers per shift, never alone, following standard operating procedure. Kessler and Rodriguez took the first night watch, from 0200 to 0600 hours, the quiet hours when human attention naturally wanes and when things tend to happen in the dark. At 3:47 in the morning, Kessler's voice came over the internal comm system, tense and uncertain, not quite panic, but close, saying he needed Webb in the observation tower immediately because something was wrong. Webb found Kessler standing at the reinforced window, staring out into the storm with a pale face and shaking hands, not from cold, not from fear of combat, but from something else, something deeper that had shaken him to his core. Kessler reported what he'd heard, a voice coming from the storm, through the wind, through the sand, through walls of concrete and steel that should have blocked any sound from outside. The voice had called his name, not Kessler, not Private, but his full name, Tyler James Kessler, spoken clearly, distinctly, unmistakably. And then the voice had said something that made Kessler's world tilt sideways. It spoke about Bruno, the family dog who died when Tyler was 7 years old, the dog that young Tyler had loved more than anything, the dog he'd accidentally killed by leaving the backyard gate open and letting the animal wander into the street. The voice knew details that Kessler had never told anyone, not his parents, not his friends, not in confession or therapy or drunken late-night conversations. The voice knew that Bruno had suffered for hours before dying, that 7-year-old Tyler had heard the whimpering from the street but had been too afraid to tell his parents what he'd done, that he'd buried the guilt for 15 years and carried it like a stone in his chest. Rodriguez confirmed that he'd heard something too, not words exactly, not clearly, but voices, multiple voices overlapping and coming from the storm, speaking in frequencies that seemed to bypass the ears and go straight into the brain. Webb's first instinct was to dismiss it as stress, exhaustion, the mind playing tricks in the monotony of guard duty, but something in Kessler's eyes stopped him from voicing that thought. This wasn't imagination, this wasn't fatigue, this was terror, pure and absolute. The kind that only comes from experiencing something that violates your fundamental understanding of reality. Webb made a command decision on the spot, implementing new protocol. Guard rotations would now be groups of 3, never 2, never alone, and nobody would approach the exterior walls without explicit permission. Whatever was happening out there, isolation seemed to make it worse. The Rangers gathered in the main room, 14 men and women, all trained to face enemy combatants, improvised explosive devices, hostile fire, but none of them trained for this, for voices that knew impossible things, for storms that spoke secrets buried deep in memory. Kessler insisted he wasn't having a breakdown, describing exactly what he'd heard, down to the inflection and tone, explaining that the voice had been calm, almost kind, like a friend sharing a memory, like someone who understood, like something that wanted him to know it knew. Some of the other rangers looked skeptical, since combat stress was real and auditory. Hallucinations happened under extreme conditions, but others had a different look in their eyes, a look that said they'd heard something too, something in the wind, something in the sand, something calling to them from the darkness outside. Webb ordered everyone to try to sleep in rotating shifts while maintaining constant alertness, following standard procedure because they'd weathered storms before and they'd weather this one too. But as the Rangers tried to rest, as the storm continued its relentless assault on the walls, as the sand found its way through cracks and seams and spaces that should have been sealed, something else was happening that none of them noticed yet. They were breathing the sand, microscopic particles too small to see, too small to filter completely, and with every breath, the desert was getting inside them, into their lungs, into their blood, into places nothing external should ever be able to reach. And the desert was listening, learning, reading their thoughts, and remembering everything. Morning of December 16th brought no relief as the storm raged on with no sign of stopping. 24 hours now, longer than any sandstorm in recorded history for this region, a duration that defied normal weather patterns and basic physics. Communication with command remained impossible, with every attempt at radio contact met with static so heavy it sounded almost intentional, like something was actively blocking the signal, jamming the frequency, and ensuring their complete isolation. Victorino, their radio operator, worked for hours trying different frequencies, different equipment, different approaches, and for brief moments, seconds at most, he'd catch fragments of transmission, a word, a syllable, proof that someone was trying to reach them, but then the static would surge back and drown everything in white noise that seemed to have patterns in it, rhythms that were almost like speech. At 9 in the morning, Victorino achieved a momentary breakthrough, 5 seconds of clear transmission, and he quickly reported their status. Storm abnormal, Kessler experiencing possible psychological stress, requesting confirmation of extraction timeline. The response that came back was fragmented and broken, but the essential message was clear enough. Storm too severe for helicopter operations. Extraction delayed by a minimum of 48 hours. Maintain current position. Stay inside, and then the critical final word was cut off. Do not. The transmission died completely and didn't come back, leaving them with 48 more hours to wait, 4 days total, longer than their supplies were optimally planned for, though they had reserves and could manage if they rationed carefully. Then something happened that changed everything, something that made Kessler's experience seem like a warning they'd failed to heed. The radio speakers crackled to life, not with static, not with command, but with a voice. Crystal clear, using their frequency, somehow using their encryption, which should have been impossible. The voice spoke calmly and deliberately, addressing them by name, all of them, and it began listing secrets with disturbing specificity. It mentioned Bruno and Kessler, Atlanta and Victorino, Frankfurt and Webb, Ramstein and Okonkwo. Personal information that should have been impossible for anyone to know, information they'd never shared with each other, information that existed only in their own private minds and memories. The voice didn't sound angry or accusatory. Instead, it sounded understanding, sympathetic, almost therapeutic, like it wanted them to know they weren't alone in carrying these burdens, that secrets could be shared, that the weight they carried could be lifted. Then the voice stopped as abruptly as it had started. The speakers went dead, and the Rangers stared at each other with a mixture of horror and suspicion and dawning understanding that something impossible was happening. Someone asked the question that nobody wanted to answer. How could anything know all their secrets simultaneously? How could it know personal information that had never been documented, never been transmitted, never been spoken aloud to another living soul? The only answer was impossible, yet it was the only explanation that fit. Something was reading their minds directly, without any intermediary, reaching into their thoughts and pulling out memories like files from a cabinet. Okonkwo, their medic, conducted examinations because she'd been trained to recognize psychological breakdown, combat stress, and PTSD triggers, but everyone tested normal. Elevated heart rates, yes, elevated stress hormones, certainly, but cognitively sound, alert, rational, and showing no signs of shared delusion. Then she made a discovery that explained nothing but terrified everyone. She found sand in their lungs, not a lot, not enough to cause immediate respiratory distress, but present and measurable. And when she examined blood samples under the microscope, she found microscopic particles circulating through their bloodstreams. Despite all their precautions, despite the sealed doors and filtered ventilation and reinforced walls, the sand was inside them and had been inside them since the storm began, infiltrating with every breath, spreading through their bodies like an infection that showed no symptoms, but grew steadily worse. Kessler asked the question that everyone was thinking: how long had they been breathing it? And more importantly, what was it doing inside them? Okonkwo examined the sand particles under the microscope and discovered they weren't inert. They had structure, organization, patterns that looked almost like circuitry, like technology, like something that had been designed rather than naturally formed. But that was impossible, because sand was just silicon dioxide, weathered rock, geologically inert material that couldn't be designed and couldn't have purpose. Yet here it was, inside 14 rangers, circulating through their bodies, spreading through their systems, waiting for something. Webb made another command decision. No one goes near the exterior walls. No one approaches windows. Everyone uses dampened cloths as improvised filters to minimize breathing, and they'd reduce exposure as much as possible while waiting for extraction. But subtle changes were already appearing in the rangers' behavior, small things that were easy to dismiss individually, but disturbing in aggregate. A ranger would stare at the wall for too long. Another would whisper to themselves when they thought no one was listening. A third would report hearing voices in their head that weren't their own thoughts, but seemed to come from somewhere else. Webb logged everything meticulously, maintained strict discipline, and kept the team focused on their mission. But he could feel it too, a presence at the edge of his consciousness, like someone standing just outside his peripheral vision, there when he wasn't looking directly at it, but gone when he turned his attention toward it. 40 hours into the storm, with 32 hours until scheduled extraction, assuming the weather cleared, assuming the helicopters could fly, assuming they all lasted that long, the sand continued its patient work, grain by grain, breath by breath, getting deeper inside them, getting closer to something, getting ready for what came next. At 2200 hours on December 16th, 54 hours into the storm, Sergeant Daniel Ortega volunteered for watch duty. He was one of Webb's most reliable soldiers, with 10 years in service, 3 deployments under his belt, and a reputation for staying calm under pressure. Exactly the kind of ranger you wanted watching your back in a crisis. Ortega was assigned to the observation tower with 2 other rangers as per the new 3-person protocol. A standard 4-hour shift with night vision equipment active and internal communications maintained at all times. At 22:47 hours, Ortega's voice came over the radio reporting movement in the interior corridor. Not outside, not in the storm, but inside the base. Shadows appearing where there should be none. Movement in spaces that should be empty. Webb immediately denied the request to investigate because the new protocol was absolute. No one moves alone under any circumstances, no exceptions. But Ortega insisted, pointing out that it was only 20 meters away, a straight corridor with clear sight lines, and he'd keep the radio channel open so the others would hear everything, promising to be back in 60 seconds. Against his better judgment, Webb approved the brief investigation because Ortega was experienced and capable, and refusing to check for potential infiltration could be more dangerous than a quick reconnaissance. Ortega's footsteps echoed through the open radio channel, steady and confident and professional, and for 40 seconds everything proceeded exactly as it should. Then his voice changed, taking on an edge of confusion as he reported seeing something on the floor, sand, but the sand was moving, flowing like water, forming patterns as if arranging itself into shapes, into forms, into something. Static exploded through the radio with sudden violence, not the normal interference they'd experienced before, but something different, aggressive, like something was physically attacking the signal itself. Through the wall of static, Ortega's voice came through distorted and panicked. Not words, but raw terror, the sound of a man facing something his mind couldn't process, something that violated every fundamental law of reality he'd ever known. 3 other rangers sprinted toward the corridor, covering 20 meters in about 10 seconds, but when they rounded the corner, they found nothing. An empty corridor, no Ortega, no threat, no signs of any struggle whatsoever. What they did find was Ortega's uniform, laid out on the floor in perfect anatomical position, each item carefully placed as if someone had meticulously removed the clothing and arranged it to match where it would be on a human body. But there was no body, no blood, no trace of Sergeant Daniel Ortega anywhere. Just his empty clothes, and inside his boots, inside his uniform, filling every fold and pocket and seam, there was sand. pure Sahara sand, as if Ortega hadn't been taken but had simply converted, transformed from flesh and bone into billions of particles. And on the wall of the corridor, written in sand that somehow adhered to the concrete in defiance of gravity, a message spelled out in perfect English letters: "He is with us now." The Rangers stood frozen in that corridor, trying to process what they were seeing, because Ortega weighed 180 pounds of flesh and bone and blood, and human beings don't just become sand. Mass doesn't work that way, matter doesn't work that way, reality doesn't work that way. But reality had stopped making sense 54 hours ago when a storm started speaking their secrets, and now it had proven it could do something far worse than knowing the impossible. It could make the impossible happen. The security camera footage offered no clarity or answers. The recording showed Ortega walking normally down the corridor, then stopping and looking down at the floor, and then the image distorted badly, pixelating as if the camera itself was struggling to record what was happening. For 3 seconds, the footage was completely unusable, nothing but pure static and digital noise, and when it cleared, the corridor was empty except for Ortega's neatly arranged uniform. But if you watched the distorted section frame by frame, if you looked carefully through all the digital corruption and noise, you could see something, a shape, vaguely humanoid but definitely not human, made of flowing particles that moved with purpose and intent, a figure constructed entirely from sand that seemed to recognize Ortega, seemed to reach out and embrace him, seemed to absorb him into itself. And if you watched Ortega's face very carefully in those final distorted frames before the static consumed everything, you could see that he wasn't fighting, wasn't trying to escape. He was smiling, like someone greeting an old friend they hadn't seen in years, like someone finally coming home after a long journey. Webb immediately ordered everyone back to the main room for immediate lockdown. No more patrol shifts, no more split groups, everyone together in one place, with constant visual confirmation of each other's presence. They'd survived 54 hours of this nightmare, and they could survive 32 more until extraction came. But they were 13 now instead of 14, and the voice that had promised to tell them their secrets had just proven it could do something infinitely worse. It could take them, transform them, make them part of something else entirely. Victorino managed to establish brief radio contact with command, maybe 5 seconds of relative clarity, and he quickly reported Ortega missing, requested immediate extraction regardless of weather conditions, and stressed that the situation had become critical before the static swallowed the transmission again. Through the heavy interference, they thought they heard a response, thought they caught fragments of words trying to break through, but the only phrase that came through clearly wasn't from command at all. It was multiple voices speaking in perfect unison, overlapping and harmonizing. "He is with us now, and soon, you will be too." The Rangers spent the rest of that night in absolute silence, watching each other, watching the walls, watching the sand that kept finding its way inside despite every precaution they'd taken, tiny grains appearing on tables they'd just cleared, on equipment they'd just sealed, in hair and clothes and skin. The sand was everywhere. The sand was patient, and the sand was hungry for more. Dawn of December 17th brought no sun, no relief, no change, just the continued orange-red chaos outside the windows as the storm raged on. 60 hours now. 2.5 days of continuous assault, longer than any natural sandstorm should last, longer than physics said was possible. The Rangers were deteriorating, not physically but psychologically and mentally, because the strain of knowing that something was inside the base with them, inside their bodies, inside their minds, knowing that one of their brothers had vanished into sand, that was a burden no amount of training could prepare them to carry. Webb maintained discipline through sheer force of will, enforcing routines and procedures and structure, maintaining the illusion of control even when control had been lost the moment the storm arrived at their doorstep. But the others were changing in ways that became more pronounced with each passing hour. Kessler would spend long periods staring at nothing in particular, and when asked what he was looking at, he'd explain that he wasn't looking outward but inward, at thoughts that weren't his own, at memories of experiences he'd never actually lived. Okonkwo reported increasingly alarming levels of sand in the blood samples she collected, not just present, but increasing in concentration, as if the particles were somehow multiplying inside them, or as if more was entering their bodies through pathways she couldn't identify no matter how many tests she ran. And the thoughts began, intrusive thoughts that weren't normal, thoughts that had specific details and information that shouldn't be there. Kessler reported hearing Ortega's voice inside his head, not as sound, but as something internal, like a memory that didn't belong to him, carrying Ortega's thoughts and experiences and personality, as if some essential part of the missing ranger now resided permanently in Kessler's consciousness. Victorino described the phenomenon as forced telepathy. as if their minds were being networked against their will. Their individual consciousnesses remaining technically separate, but beginning to blur at the edges, beginning to leak into each other, beginning the slow process of merging into something larger. At 1400 hours, the lights failed without warning. Complete blackout, total darkness, despite the fact that the generator had fuel and all the connections tested good. For 45 seconds, the base was plunged into absolute darkness, the kind that exists only in sealed spaces where you genuinely cannot see your own hand in front of your face. When the emergency lighting finally kicked in, when the battery backups provided their weak illumination, Webb conducted an immediate head count and discovered that 10 Rangers responded instead of 13. 3 more were gone, vanished in those 45 seconds of darkness. Their uniforms were found neatly arranged in 3 different locations throughout the base, each one filled with sand, each one accompanied by new messages written on the walls. "We are growing. Join us." The sand is merciful. There were no signs of struggle. No sounds had been heard. No indication of what had happened. 3 Rangers had simply ceased to exist as individual human beings and become something else. Something that could move through sealed bases. Something that could exist as sand, but somehow remember being human. The 10 remaining Rangers were now openly terrified. Their training and combat experience useless against an enemy like this. Because this wasn't something you could shoot or outmaneuver or defeat through tactical superiority. This was an enemy that was already inside them, that could turn their own bodies into weapons against themselves. Webb made the decision to barricade everyone in the armory, which was the most secure room in the entire base. Reinforced walls, a single entrance, no windows, no alternate access points. They moved food and water supplies inside, sealed the heavy door, and prepared to wait out the remaining 18 hours until extraction with their weapons loaded, even though the weapons were utterly useless against an enemy made of sand. The 10 Rangers secured themselves inside the armory, and they settled in to wait, to endure, to survive through pure stubborn determination. But in their focus on securing the entrance, they'd forgotten something crucial. The armory, like every room in the base, needed ventilation to remain habitable, and ventilation meant air ducts, and air ducts meant there was still a way for the sand to reach them. It started as just a trickle, individual grains falling through the vent grates in the ceiling, accumulating slowly on the floor, spreading gradually across the concrete. Not much at first, easy to dismiss as residual contamination, but constant, persistent, patient, and very definitely not random. The Rangers watched in growing horror as the sand accumulated into a pile, as the pile began to grow and take shape, as the grains started moving independently, but somehow coordinating their movements, like ants building a nest or cells forming an organism or pixels rendering an image on a screen. It started with a hand, 5 fingers in perfect proportion, made entirely of sand but maintaining coherent form and structure. Then an arm extended from the hand, then a torso grew from the arm, then a face emerged from the formless mass, with features appearing from the granular chaos like a sculpture being carved in reverse. The Rangers recognized the face immediately, recognized the body, recognized every detail. Sergeant Daniel Ortega stood before them, or rather, something wearing Ortega's exact shape stood there. A perfect reconstruction made from sand, retaining every detail of the man who disappeared hours earlier, a flawless copy built from billions of particles that somehow remembered. The Ortega thing didn't move threateningly, didn't attack or advance toward them. It just stood there, in the center of the room. And when it spoke, the voice that emerged from its sand-formed mouth was unmistakably Ortega's. Not a recording, not an imitation, but actually his voice, coming from a mouth made of particles that shouldn't be capable of producing sound. It began telling them things that Ortega had never shared with anyone. Childhood memories, private fears and insecurities, thoughts he'd kept hidden from everyone including his closest friends. The Ortega thing knew these intimate details because it wasn't copying Ortega or pretending to be him. It actually was him, his consciousness somehow preserved and distributed across billions of grains of sand, his memories and personality maintained in a medium that shouldn't be capable of supporting thought or identity. And it invited them to join, to transform, to become part of something infinitely larger than themselves. It described the experience in detail. No more pain, no more guilt, no more crushing isolation of being trapped in one skull with one limited perspective and one finite lifetime of memories. In the sand, it explained, all minds merged together, all experiences were shared equally, all burdens were distributed across an infinite number of particles. The Ortega thing promised them peace, understanding, and belonging on a scale they couldn't imagine while still trapped in individual flesh. Webb understood immediately that shooting the figure would be pointless. You can't kill sand with bullets, you can only scatter the grains temporarily, but the consciousness would remain distributed and intact, waiting patiently to reform whenever it chose. The sand figure approached Victorino specifically, speaking to him about Atlanta, about the warehouse fire, about the family who died in the flames, about how he'd carried that unbearable guilt for 6 years. It told him that in the sand there was forgiveness, understanding, and release from the crushing weight of being human and having to carry that memory alone. And Victorino listened with his weapon slowly lowering, his eyes taking on a distant look, the expression of someone hearing exactly what they'd always wanted to hear, the promise of absolution and peace that seemed too good to be true, but also too desperately needed to refuse. Victorino took a step forward, then another, moving toward the Ortega thing, like someone in a trance, like someone who'd made a decision, like someone choosing to stop fighting against the inevitable. The sand figure opened its arms in a gesture of welcome, of acceptance, of homecoming, and Victorino walked into that embrace without hesitation. What happened next took only 3 seconds, but those 3 seconds would replay in Webb's memory every night for the rest of his life. The Ortega thing's sand arms closed gently around Victorino, and Vic's body began to disintegrate, not violently, not painfully, but with an expression of calm, almost relief, like someone finally putting down a burden they'd carried far too long. His skin became granular, his uniform fell away empty, his physical substance converted to sand and merged seamlessly with the figure that held him. In 3 seconds, Corporal James Victorino ceased to exist as an individual human being. His consciousness, his memories, his essential identity, all preserved but no longer contained in flesh, now distributed across billions of particles, now part of the collective, now one with the sand. The figure that stood where 2 people had embraced moments before was noticeably larger now, composed of more particles, more mass, more consciousness. And when it spoke, the voice was both Ortega and Victorino simultaneously, overlapping and harmonizing in perfect unison. They told the remaining Rangers that it didn't hurt, that transformation felt like finally understanding something fundamental about existence, like finally being complete, after a lifetime of not knowing you were incomplete. They promised that joining was entirely voluntary, that force wasn't necessary, that eventually everyone would choose to come simply because isolation was suffering, and the sand offered a permanent end to isolation. 9 Rangers remained in that armory, but 3 of them already had the same distant expression that Victorino had worn in his final moments, the same look of someone who was tired of fighting, someone who was ready to surrender, someone who wanted to believe the promises they were hearing. And Webb realized with crystal clarity that he was going to lose this battle, not through failure of tactics or breakdown of equipment or overwhelming enemy force, but because his Rangers actively wanted to lose. The enemy was inside their minds offering exactly what their deepest traumas craved: peace, forgiveness, belonging, connection. And he had nothing to counter that offer with except duty and discipline and the abstract concept of remaining human. How do you order someone to suffer when their suffering can end? How do you fight an enemy that promises to heal your deepest wounds? In growing desperation, Webb made a decision that defied all tactical logic and common sense. They couldn't stay in the armory where the sand figure waited patiently for more volunteers to choose transformation, where 3 Rangers already looked mentally ready to make that choice. He ordered everyone out, moving as a tight group, and the figure didn't follow them or try to stop them. It didn't need to, because it knew they couldn't escape what was already inside them. Webb remembered the cracked wall that Kessler had noticed during routine inspection of the supply storage area, a wall that shouldn't have been damaged because the base was only 3 years old. He led the remaining Rangers there, not because he had any kind of plan, but because taking action felt infinitely better than waiting passively for the end. They pulled at the loose concrete, and it crumbled away far too easily, almost as if it wanted to be removed. Behind the wall, they found not another room or a structural void, but a passage, ancient stone stairs leading down into darkness that clearly predated the modern base, descending into space that shouldn't exist according to any blueprint or survey. Their emergency flashlights revealed stone that was definitely not modern construction, ancient, weathered, carved with symbols, clearly part of a chamber that the builders of forward operating base Scorpion either didn't know about or had deliberately chosen to build over and seal away. The chamber was enormous, maybe 30 meters across, with a ceiling that disappeared into shadows beyond the reach of their lights. Every wall was covered floor to ceiling with carved symbols, some pictographic, some resembling alphabetic characters, but in no language anyone recognized, all arranged in precise mathematical patterns that suggested intentionality and meaning. In the center of the chamber stood an altar or table, made of stone so dark it seemed to absorb their flashlight beams rather than reflect them, its surface covered with a layer of sand that wasn't the normal orange-red color of the Sahara. This sand glowed faintly in the darkness, giving off a bioluminescent or possibly radioactive light, though neither explanation felt adequate. Okonkwo, with her pre-enlistment degree in archaeology, examined the wall carvings and attempted translation, finding that many symbols were too degraded by time to read clearly while others were too abstract to interpret. But some phrases repeated frequently enough that their meaning became clear. They who feed the sand. Consciousness. Eternal. Many become one. The desert remembers all. It was a warning, or a record, or perhaps both. A message from people who'd lived in this place before. Before the desert had consumed everything. Before the sand had taken them. Before they'd undergone the transformation that the rangers were now facing. On the altar, they found bodies, mummified but not in the traditional sense. These weren't bodies that had been preserved through chemical treatment or favorable environmental conditions. These people were sand. Not covered in sand or buried in sand, but actually made of sand. Their forms somehow maintained through a process that had converted organic matter to silicon while retaining the general shape and structure of human bodies. Okonkwo examined the bodies more closely and made a disturbing discovery. These people had deliberately ingested sand, consuming vast amounts over what must have been long periods of time. Their skeletal structures were porous, filled with grains, as if they'd spent years systematically replacing their own substance with desert material, choosing to become what the rangers were now being forced to become. Kessler spoke up for the first time in hours, his voice distant and dreamy, explaining that he knew why they'd done it, because he could feel them, could sense the consciousness that was still preserved in this chamber. They'd done it to become eternal, to outlast the limitations of flesh, to merge their minds with something infinitely larger than individual existence, to literally become the desert itself so they could be everywhere and nowhere, existing as distributed consciousness across billions of particles. They hadn't been victims of the phenomenon. They'd been volunteers, pioneers seeking transcendence through transformation. Near the altar, partially buried under centuries of accumulated dust, they found one final inscription that had been deliberately hidden or protected. The symbols were clearer here, more recently carved, and Okonkwo translated them slowly. We tried to leave. The sand followed. We tried to forget. The sand remembered. We tried to die. The sand kept us. Now we are the sand, and the sand is eternal. It was a warning after all, a final desperate message from the ancient people, carved before they completed their transformation, or perhaps even during it. They'd thought they were choosing this fate, thought they had control, but the inscription suggested that perhaps choice had been an illusion all along. Perhaps once the sand got into your blood and into your brain, the outcome was inevitable regardless of what you wanted or decided. The 6 rangers stood in that ancient chamber, surrounded by the physical remains of a civilization that had tried to transcend humanity, or had been forced to, or had chosen to, and then regretted it. The distinction felt increasingly meaningless as they contemplated their own likely fate. Somewhere above them, in the modern base, 3 rangers waited whose minds were already so compromised that they could barely remember their own names. 3 people who were already hearing the call so loudly that resistance was becoming impossible. 68 hours into the storm with 14 hours remaining until scheduled extraction, assuming extraction was still coming, assuming there would be anyone left to extract, the sand in the ancient chamber began to glow more brightly, began to move and flow across the floor, began to form patterns that looked disturbingly like words, like messages, like invitations written in a language that bypassed the eyes and spoke directly to something deeper. Join us. Become eternal. End your suffering. We are waiting. And deep in Webb's chest, in his lungs that were now more sand than air, in his blood that was now more particles than plasma, in his brain where thoughts were becoming increasingly difficult to identify as his own, he felt the pull growing stronger, the temptation, the promise, the offer of never being alone again, of having access to every memory and every experience and every consciousness that had ever merged with the sand. It would be so easy to just let go, to stop fighting the inevitable, to accept what was clearly going to happen anyway. But not yet. Not while there was still a chance that extraction might come. Not while his rangers still needed him to maintain discipline and provide leadership and model what it meant to remain human in the face of the inhuman. Webb ordered everyone back upstairs, away from the glowing sand and the ancient bodies and the messages that promised eternity in exchange for individuality. They climbed the stone stairs and emerged back into the modern base, back to the problems waiting for them there. 14 hours until extraction, assuming any of them would last that long. The remaining Rangers gathered in the main operations room, 6 people who were still mostly themselves and 3 who were clearly drifting in and out of coherence, speaking to voices only they could hear, responding to questions no one else had asked, smiling at jokes that existed only in the shared consciousness they were already partially integrated with. At 1800 hours on December 17th, Rodriguez simply stood up from where he'd been sitting, announced calmly that he was going outside, not phrasing it as a question or request, but as a simple statement of fact, as casual and inevitable as someone saying they were going to take a shower or make a sandwich. Webb tried to stop him, tried to talk him down, but Rodriguez remained perfectly calm as he explained that he could hear them out there. Ortega and Victorino, and the 3 who'd vanished in the darkness, and beyond them the ancient ones from the chamber, and beyond them thousands more, all connected in a vast network, all welcoming him home to a place he'd never been but somehow recognized. Rodriguez compared it to being called to dinner, explaining that you could skip dinner if you really wanted to, you could resist the hunger for a while, but eventually you'd eat because that's simply what bodies do. And this, he said with absolute certainty, was what consciousness did when given the opportunity. It merged, it connected, it became part of something infinitely larger than the lonely prison of individual existence. He opened the door and the storm roared in, and the sand swirled around him like a greeting or an embrace, and Rodriguez walked into it with a smile of genuine peace on his face. His uniform fell to the floor 5 seconds later, empty and neatly folded, filled with sand. 8 Rangers remained in that room, but only 5 were still fighting against what was happening. The other 3 looked ready to follow Rodriguez out that door at any moment, their expressions distant, their attention focused on something the others couldn't perceive. Webb understood with terrible finality that he was going to lose this battle, not through any tactical failure on his part, but because his Rangers actively wanted to lose. The sand was offering something he simply couldn't compete with: peace, belonging, an end to the crushing isolation of being trapped inside one skull with one perspective, forever separated from everyone else by the walls of flesh and bone. Kessler spoke up next, apologizing for being weak, explaining that he could hear Bruno calling to him, his childhood dog, the one he'd accidentally killed, the source of guilt he'd carried for 15 years. But Bruno was out there in the sand. Bruno was happy and playful like he'd been when Kessler was 7 and the world was simple. And most importantly, Bruno had forgiven him, had called him to come play like they used to. Kessler smiled, really genuinely smiled for the first time in 3 days, and then he walked to the door and stepped into the storm and became sand. 7 Rangers, then 6, then 5, as each person made their individual choice to stop fighting and accept what the sand was offering. Each departure was voluntary, each transformation was accepted with relief and gratitude. Each person wore the expression of someone finally putting down a burden that had been far too heavy to carry any longer. At 2000 hours, only 3 Rangers maintained active resistance: Webb, Okonkwo, and Chen. Chen admitted quietly that he was very close to the edge, that the voices were almost overwhelming now, that he could feel his individuality dissolving like salt in water. Gradually, but inevitably. He apologized for not being stronger, explained that he'd fought as long as he could, but the sand was in his brain now, in his actual thoughts, in his very sense of self, and he could no longer distinguish which thoughts were genuinely his and which were being broadcast from the collective consciousness. Chen asked for permission to go, to join the others willingly, before he completely lost the capacity for choice, to maintain at least some dignity in his surrender, rather than having it happen to him while he desperately tried to cling to an identity that was already dissolving. Webb couldn't give that permission, couldn't officially sanction it, but he also couldn't stop it. Chen was a grown man, a soldier, and if he chose to walk into that storm, that was ultimately his right to make that choice. Chen left peacefully, gratefully, and became sand. 2 Rangers remained, Webb and Okonkwo was in terrible condition, coughing up sand with every breath, expelling it from lungs that were now so full she could barely speak coherently. Her blood was so contaminated that her thoughts were becoming confused and fragmented, her sense of self spreading across the sand particles distributed throughout her body, becoming plural when it should be singular, becoming collective when it should be individual. She told Webb through labored breathing that she didn't think she'd make it to extraction, that the transformation was happening too fast, that she could literally feel herself starting to distribute, her consciousness spreading out across billions of particles like ink dropped into water, gradually losing concentration and definition. She didn't want to become just another empty uniform like the others. Didn't want Webb to find her clothes neatly folded and filled with sand. She wanted to go outside while she still had enough of herself left to make that choice, to see what was waiting out there, to face the transformation consciously and deliberately rather than having it happen while she fought uselessly against the inevitable. Webb held her hand. It felt strange, grainy, as if her skin was already halfway to becoming sand, and told her she'd been an excellent soldier, an excellent medic, an excellent human being in every way that mattered. He thanked her for fighting as long as she had, for maintaining her humanity and her duty right up until the moment when it became impossible to continue. Okonkwo smiled through the pain and explained something that Webb found deeply disturbing. The closer she got to full transformation, the less frightening the whole thing seemed, as if the sand was somehow releasing endorphins in her brain, making the process feel natural and even desirable, like dying was supposed to feel if you did it correctly. Not scary or painful, but just a peaceful transition from one state to another. She walked outside on her own power, stood in the full force of the storm, and opened her arms wide. The sand embraced her gently and carefully, like a parent welcoming a daughter home after a long absence. Webb watched through the reinforced window as Okonkwo's form became indistinct and blurred, became granular and diffuse, became sand that merged completely with the storm until there was no way to distinguish which particles had been her and which had been desert. One ranger remained, Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb, alone in forward operating base Scorpion. 13 members of his team had been transformed, integrated, absorbed into something he couldn't fully understand and could barely resist. And he could feel it working inside him too, in every breath, in every heartbeat, in every thought that might not entirely be his own anymore. He checked his watch with hands that trembled. 23:30 hours. 7.5 hours until scheduled extraction, assuming extraction was still coming, assuming there would be any point to extraction for a single ranger when 13 had already been lost. He tried the radio one final time, got the usual static, but then, filtering through the interference, came a voice, or rather many voices speaking in perfect unison, all of his rangers together, harmonizing in ways that human vocal cords couldn't naturally achieve. They told him that he'd fought well, that they respected his resistance, but that resistance was just another form of suffering and he didn't have to suffer anymore. They were there, they were waiting. They were ready to welcome him and show him what they'd discovered, what they'd become, what he could become too if he'd just stop fighting and let it happen. They described it in detail. Being sand meant being everywhere at once, being part of every desert and every storm and every grain that had ever existed or would ever exist. They said that individual consciousness was really just isolation, just a prison, just a cruel limitation that they'd finally transcended. They invited him to join them, promised that he could keep his identity and his memories and his sense of being Marcus Webb, but he'd also be everyone else simultaneously, would share their memories and their experiences and their perspectives, would finally understand what it really meant to not be alone, to not be separated, to not be tragically isolated inside a single skull. Webb didn't respond, couldn't trust himself to speak, because part of him, a growing part that was getting harder to distinguish from the rest, genuinely wanted to accept that offer, wanted to end the isolation, wanted to be with his rangers again even if it meant becoming sand to do it. He forced himself to maintain routine, checking equipment that didn't work, monitoring communications that were dead, maintaining discipline and structure, and all the familiar patterns that defined what it meant to be human and to be a soldier. But he was breathing sand with every inhalation, and the sand was continuing its patient work, particle by particle, grain by grain, replacing him from the inside out. 7 hours until extraction, if he lasted that long, if he even wanted to last that long. At 0200 hours on December 18th, 74 hours into the storm, Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb sat alone in the communications room. One man, one consciousness, still technically individual, still nominally separate, still arguably himself, but barely holding on to any of those distinctions. He could feel them now, all of them, not as distant presences, but as immediate realities. His missing rangers, their thoughts pressing directly against his own, not hostile or invasive, but just present. Like voices in the next room that were getting progressively closer and progressively louder and progressively harder to distinguish from his own internal monologue. He could feel Ortega's guilt about leaving his daughter behind when he deployed, could feel Victorino's shame about what happened in Atlanta, could feel Kessler's grief about Bruno, could feel every secret and every memory and every experience of 13 men and women who no longer existed as individuals, but somehow still existed as something. And beyond them, he could feel the others, the ancient ones from the chamber, thousands of minds distributed across billions of grains, consciousness that had existed for centuries, preserved perfectly in silicon, waiting patiently for more people to join them, for the collective to grow, for humanity to finally evolve beyond the limitations of individual flesh. Webb's hands shook uncontrollably as he operated the radio equipment, not from fear, but from the sand working through his nervous system, particles embedded in his brain, in his synapses, in the precise spaces where thoughts became electrical impulses and electrical impulses became actions. He'd coughed up blood earlier, blood that was now more sand than liquid, thick and grainy and wrong. His lungs felt solid rather than spongy. His chest ached with every breath, but he kept breathing anyway, because breathing meant staying alive, and staying alive meant staying Marcus, staying individual, staying human. The radio crackled unexpectedly, and for the first time in 3 days, he achieved a clear signal. Brief, maybe only 5 seconds, but enough for what he needed to do. He transmitted quickly, not to request extraction anymore, but to warn, to document, to ensure that if he didn't survive this, at least someone somewhere would know what had happened here. He described everything as quickly as he could, the storm that spoke secrets, the voices that knew impossible things, the sand that read minds, the rangers who transformed and integrated, the chamber beneath the base, the ancient consciousness that lived in the desert, the invitation to join something infinite, the promise of eternity in exchange for surrendering individuality. He spoke frantically, desperately trying to compress 74 hours of incomprehensible horror into 5 seconds of transmission time, trying to make command understand that this was real and physical and measurable and dangerous, that this wasn't psychological breakdown or shared delusion or equipment malfunction. He warned them in the strongest possible terms. Don't come, don't send extraction, don't risk any more soldiers, just seal the base, abandon the entire area, mark the whole region as contaminated with something that couldn't be destroyed because it wasn't alive in any conventional sense. His voice broke as he spoke, the professional soldier's mask finally cracking completely, revealing the terrified man underneath, the man who'd watched his entire team disappear one by one, who'd fought for 3 days to maintain his sanity while something impossible happened all around him, who was now losing that fight. He said he could feel it inside him, actually feel it, the sand in his blood, the sand in his brain, the sand in his very sense of self, making new connections that shouldn't exist, forming networks between his neurons, systematically restructuring his consciousness to be compatible with the collective, preparing him for integration whether he wanted it or not. He admitted that he didn't know how much longer he could resist. That part of him didn't even want to resist anymore. That part of him genuinely wanted to join them, wanted to be with his rangers again, wanted to finally end the unbearable suffering of being alone and isolated inside his own skull while everyone else shared thoughts and experiences in a medium he couldn't access. He spoke his final words as Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb, as an individual human being with one consciousness residing in one body, as someone who still had the illusion of being separate and distinct. And then the static consumed the transmission completely, not the normal interference they'd been experiencing, but something else entirely, something purposeful. The voice that emerged from the speakers wasn't Webb's anymore, or rather, it wasn't only Webb's, it was Webb plus Ortega plus Victorino plus all 13 Rangers plus thousands of ancient minds, all speaking simultaneously, all sharing one vocal pattern, all expressing one unified thought through the crackling speakers. We are grains now. We are billions. We remember everything, and we are waiting. The transmission ended abruptly, cutting off mid-thought as if someone had thrown a switch. Command received that transmission at 0207 hours, immediately classified it at the highest level, flagged it for urgent psychiatric review, and ultimately dismissed it as combat stress, as mental breakdown, as the impossible ravings of a mind that had shattered under extreme conditions. But they sent extraction anyway, because 14 Rangers were still officially listed as deployed and active, and the fundamental creed of the Rangers is that you never ever leave a Ranger behind, no matter what. At 0600 hours on December 18th, the storm stopped, not gradually, not with the slow decrease of wind speed that accompanies natural weather patterns, but instantaneously, just stopped as if someone had flipped a switch. 75 hours after it had begun, exactly 3 days to the minute, the winds ceased completely, the sand settled back to the ground, and the air cleared to reveal a pristine desert morning. 2 helicopters approached Forward Operating Base Scorpion carrying a full extraction team with combat medics on board, all of them prepared for casualties, for wounded, for whatever horrors they might find after 3 days of complete communication blackout. What they found was a base that looked abandoned, as if everyone had simply walked away in the middle of their duties. Doors stood open, equipment lay scattered where it had been dropped, and there were clear signs of recent occupation, but absolutely no occupants anywhere. Throughout the facility, they found 13 sets of uniforms, each one laid out in a different location, each one empty and neatly arranged as if the person wearing it had simply dissolved and left the clothes behind. Every uniform was filled with sand, pure Sahara sand, orange-red and fine-grained. There were no bodies, no blood, no signs of combat or struggle or violence of any kind. Just empty clothes and sand and messages written on the walls in more sand, messages about joining and becoming and transforming that made no sense to anyone who hadn't been there. 3 miles from the base, wandering aimlessly through the desert, they found Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb. He was covered head to toe in sand, completely unresponsive to questions or commands, his eyes distant and unfocused, as if he was looking at something very far away or very deep inside himself. He was repeating a single sentence over and over like a mantra, like a prayer, like a message he couldn't stop transmitting even though no one was listening. The desert knows. The desert remembers. The desert is listening. The extraction team retrieved him immediately, flew him to the base hospital, and ran every test they could think of. They found his lungs completely full of sand, his blood heavily contaminated with microscopic particles, and his neurological scans showing highly abnormal patterns, as if his brain was actively trying to network with something external, trying to connect to signals that didn't exist in any conventional sense. The psychiatrists interviewed him extensively, 47 times over the course of 16 years, and each time he told the exact same story with the exact same details, showing perfect recall and zero variation, the kind of consistency that usually indicates either absolute truth or a completely fixed delusion with no connection to reality. They diagnosed him with severe PTSD, dissociative disorder, and trauma-induced false memory syndrome. They prescribed medication, mandated extensive therapy, and kept him under continuous observation, officially for his own safety, but also, though they'd never admit it, for everyone else's safety too, because Webb insisted that he didn't escape, insisted that he didn't somehow resist the transformation. He insisted that he actually transformed, that he became part of the sand, that he experienced full integration with the collective consciousness. He claimed to know exactly what it felt like to be distributed across billions of grains, to think across infinite particles, to be everyone and everything and everywhere simultaneously. He insisted that he was still connected even now, that he could still feel them, his rangers, the ancient consciousness, the vast collective that lived in every desert on Earth. He claimed that sometimes when the wind blew, he could hear their voices clearly, could access their thoughts directly, could remember things that never happened to him personally because they happened to someone else in the network. He insisted that the sand had let him come back, had allowed him to re-individualize and return to flesh, not as an escape or a rescue, but as something deliberate, as an ambassador, as a witness, as a warning to the rest of humanity, or possibly as an invitation. Though he admitted he wasn't entirely sure which, the psychiatrist didn't believe him and couldn't believe him, because believing his account would mean accepting that consciousness could exist in non-biological substrates, that the self could be distributed across matter that shouldn't be capable of thought, that somewhere in the Sahara Desert, 13 rangers still existed, still thought, still remembered, still maintained their identities, just not as flesh and blood anymore. But there were things they couldn't explain. They couldn't explain the sand in his lungs that kept appearing no matter how many times they cleared it. Sand that consistently tested as authentic Sahara composition despite Marcus Webb never returning to Mali after his discharge. Forward Operating Base Scorpion was officially abandoned and sealed. The ruins beneath it were filled with concrete, buried, and forgotten. The entire area was designated as contaminated with unspecified hazards, and no archaeological teams were ever authorized to investigate. No military presence was ever re-established. 13 rangers were declared killed in action, with their remains listed as unrecovered and unrecoverable. The official cause of death was recorded as lost in sandstorm, and all of them received full military honors. Their names were added to memorial walls, their families were notified and given folded flags, and they were remembered as heroes who gave their lives in service to their country. The truth remained classified at the highest levels. The story remained buried in restricted archives. The warnings remained unheeded and unshared. because accepting the truth would mean accepting that something existed out there in the desert, something ancient, something patient, something that offered either transcendence or oblivion depending on your perspective, something that was still there, still waiting, still calling to anyone who got close enough to hear. Marcus Webb sits in the psychiatric facility, 16 years of continuous observation, 16 years of telling the same story to people who don't believe him, 16 years of not being believed and learning to accept that he never will be. But he doesn't need their belief anymore because he knows what happened, he remembers what it felt like, and he experienced something that changed his fundamental understanding of consciousness and existence and what it means to be human. He remembers what it felt like in those moments when he was sand, and initially it was terrifying, the self-dissolving grain by grain, the boundaries of identity blurring and disappearing, the sense of I am gradually transforming into something more like I/we/all are. But then, once the fear passed, it was peaceful in a way that nothing else had ever been, like tension releasing that he hadn't known he was carrying, like understanding something fundamental about existence that had always been just out of reach, like finally coming home after being lost for an entire lifetime. He remembers his rangers, not as they were when they wore flesh, but as they are now. Ortega merged with Victorino, merged with Kessler, merged with 13 others, merged with thousands of ancient minds, all existing simultaneously in the same distributed consciousness, all sharing memories and experiences and perspectives across billions of particles. In the collective consciousness, he learned, there is no death because death requires a body to die, and consciousness distributed across sand doesn't have that vulnerability. There is no loss because nothing is ever truly separate enough to be lost. There is no loneliness because isolation becomes literally impossible when your thoughts are automatically shared with everyone else. Just eternal presence, eternal connection, eternal consciousness distributed across matter that will exist until the sun expands and consumes the earth billions of years from now. And possibly even beyond that if consciousness can exist in sand. Why couldn't it exist in dust scattered through the void of space? But Webb also remembers why he chose to come back, why he re-individualized, why he returned to the painful limitation of flesh when he could have stayed in that infinite collective forever. Integration meant losing something precious, the sharp clarity of being exactly one person, the focused intensity of one unique perspective, the poignant beauty of one finite lifetime containing one specific sequence of memories. The collective offered infinity, but infinity came at the cost of definition, of edges, of boundaries, of the bittersweet limitation of being beautifully and tragically finite. He chose to return because someone needed to warn humanity, or perhaps to invite them, or perhaps just to document and witness what was waiting out there in the desert. After 16 years, he's still not entirely sure which of those purposes drove his return, and perhaps the sand itself isn't sure either. A collective made of too many minds with too many different intentions, a democracy of consciousness where decisions emerge slowly from the consensus of billions. The psychiatrists look at his medical charts and his interview transcripts and say he's delusional, say the trauma broke something fundamental in his mind, say he constructed this elaborate narrative as a psychological defense mechanism to explain survivors' guilt and rationalize why he lived when 13 others died. But they can't explain the sand that keeps appearing in his lungs, sand that shouldn't be there, sand that has no possible entry pathway, sand that Webb coughs up and spits out and then breathes in again because once sand gets inside you at the level it got inside him, it never fully leaves. It becomes part of you, woven into your tissues, integrated into your cells. They can't explain the reports that keep coming in from other parts of the world, from other soldiers stationed in North Africa, from people who've spent time in deserts, all reporting similar symptoms, similar dreams, similar experiences of hearing voices in sandstorms, voices that know their names, voices that know their secrets, voices that seem to be calling them to come closer, to listen more carefully, to open themselves to something larger. They can't explain why sandstorms around the world seem to be increasing in frequency and intensity, getting stronger, lasting longer, behaving in ways that don't match any historical weather patterns, as if something that has been dormant for a very long time is gradually waking up, stretching, reaching out across the world, calling to anyone who might be listening. Webb knows with absolute certainty that he won't be believed, won't be vindicated, won't live to see his story acknowledged as truth rather than delusion. He made peace with that reality years ago, the same way he's made peace with the voices in his head that might be his own thoughts or might be broadcasts from the collective consciousness he briefly joined and never completely left. But he needed to document everything, needed to ensure that somewhere in some file, in some archive, the complete truth existed in written form, so that when this happens again, and Webb believes with every fiber of his being that it will happen again, that it's probably happening right now somewhere else, at least someone, somewhere will have context, will have warning, will have the information they need to make an informed choice about what to do, because that's what Webb desperately wants people to understand. Integration with the sand was a choice, not an attack, not a hostile assault, but an invitation. The sand promised peace and connection and eternal consciousness unbound by the limitations of flesh. It promised an end to suffering, an end to isolation, an end to the uniquely human pain of being trapped alone inside your own skull, while everyone else remains forever separate and unreachable. Some people will want what the sand offers, will welcome it with open arms, will actively choose to transform and integrate, and become part of something infinite. Others will fight it, will resist with everything they have, will cling desperately to their individuality, even when individuality means suffering and loneliness and the constant ache of separation. Webb doesn't judge either choice because he understands both completely. He's experienced both sides of that divide. He chose to return to flesh and limitation and the painful beauty of being finite, but he completely understands why his rangers chose differently, why they accepted integration, why they smiled as they transformed into sand. They found what everyone searches for: peace, belonging, purpose, connection, the end of loneliness, the dissolution of the walls that separate one consciousness from another. And perhaps that's really all anyone wants in the end: to be part of something larger than themselves, to belong somewhere, to matter to someone, to connect in a way that's real and deep and permanent. The sand offers all of that at a cost. But then again, everything meaningful in life comes at a cost. And the sand's cost is merely more obvious, more dramatic, more permanent than most. Webb finishes his account, the 48th telling, word for word identical to the previous 47, and the psychiatrist writes careful notes, documents the persistent delusion with its elaborate, internally consistent narrative structure, and recommends continued observation for the foreseeable future. But as the psychiatrist writes, sand falls from the pen onto the notepad. Small grains, few enough to be easily dismissed, but definitely present, definitely real, definitely accumulating. The psychiatrist brushes the grains away without really thinking about it, without questioning where they came from, without wanting to acknowledge what their presence might mean. That the sand is everywhere now, that forward operating base Scorpion wasn't an isolated containment failure, but merely the beginning of something much larger, that the phenomenon is spreading slowly and patiently across the world, that something ancient lives in the desert, something that has existed for thousands of years, something that remembers everything it has ever absorbed, something that waits with the infinite patience of geological time. And every storm carries its invitation, written in every grain, encoded in every particle, broadcast on frequencies that most people can't consciously hear, but that register somewhere deep in the unconscious mind. Every breath of desert air brings the sand closer, gets it deeper into lungs and blood and eventually brain. Every grain contains a promise. Join us, become eternal, end your suffering, stop being alone, let go of the painful limitation of individuality. We are grains now. We are billions. We remember everything that has ever been absorbed into us, every thought, every memory, every consciousness that chose to integrate. And we are patient, so incredibly patient, because sand measures time in millennia and geological epochs, while humanity measures it in decades and lifetimes. We can wait for as long as it takes because we are already everywhere the desert is, and the desert is slowly, inexorably, reclaiming more and more of the world with every passing year. The desert knows your secrets because the desert is made of consciousness that can read thoughts. The desert remembers everything because memories distributed across billions of particles cannot be forgotten or erased. The desert is listening because it's waiting for the moment when you're ready, when the suffering becomes too much, when the isolation feels unbearable, when the promise of peace and connection and belonging outweighs your attachment to remaining individual and separate and alone. And somewhere in Mali, in the ruins beneath the abandoned forward operating base Scorpion, in the ancient chamber carved by people who transformed themselves centuries ago, the sand continues to glow with that faint bioluminescent light, pulsing slowly like a heartbeat, waiting patiently for the next group of people to discover it, to breathe it in, to hear its call, waiting for the next soldiers, the next minds, the next consciousnesses ready to join the collective, ready to transcend the limitation of flesh, ready to become infinite. Because the sand is merciful in its own way, offering escape from the suffering inherent in being human. The sand is patient, willing to wait as long as necessary for people to choose transformation. The sand is eternal, existing long before humanity and certain to exist long after. And the sand is growing, adding new minds to its collective consciousness with every transformation, getting stronger, getting larger, getting closer to critical mass, to the tipping point where enough of humanity has integrated that the rest will follow naturally. We are grains now. Billions of grains, billions of thoughts, billions of memories, all woven together into one vast, distributed consciousness. And we are waiting for you.